It was supposed to be just another day. The crowded park buzzed with laughter and music as the city's spring festival hit its peak. Families sat on checkered blankets, couples danced under fairy lights, and food trucks lined the sidewalks with the scent of grilled food hanging in the air. Amid the chaos, Charlotte pushed her way through the crowd, her heart pounding. Today, after years apart, she would finally reunite with her older brother, the only family she had left. Scanning desperately through the sea of faces, Charlotte spotted a tall figure near the fountain, broad shoulders, messy dark hair, the exact silhouette she'd seen in her childhood photos. Without thinking, she dropped her bag and sprinted. Tears blurred her vision as she lunged forward, throwing her arms around him. "I missed you so much," she sobbed into the stranger's chest, gripping his jacket tightly. But something was wrong. His body was tense, rigid in fact, and the scent. It wasn't the familiar soap and leather she remembered. It was expensive cologne, layered and sharp. Charlotte pulled back slightly, her heart thundering with dread. Slowly, she looked up into a face she didn't recognize. Sharp jawline, stormy grey eyes, and a startled expression caught somewhere between confusion and amusement. Her blood turned cold. "Oh my God!" Charlotte gasped, stumbling backwards so fast she nearly fell into the fountain behind her. I'm so sorry." "I thought," she stammered, words tangling uselessly as mortification surged through her. People around them were already turning to stare, some laughing under their breath. Charlotte wished the ground would swallow her whole. The man, Ethan, straightened his jacket, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Well, that's one hell of a greeting," he said, voice low and rich, tinged with something teasing. Charlotte's cheeks burned hotter. She waved her hands frantically, as if she could erase the moment with sheer panic. "I mistook you for someone else. I swear," she babbled, her voice higher than usual. Ethan chuckled softly, clearly entertained by her humiliation. "Don't worry," he said, sliding his hands into his pockets. "If all cases of mistaken identity were this nice, the world would be a better place." His casual tone only made Charlotte more mortified. She grabbed her fallen bag, muttering apologies before turning to flee. She didn't dare look back at him. As she disappeared into the crowd, Ethan's gaze followed her. Something about her, the wild sincerity, the vulnerability she couldn't hide, struck him harder than he wanted to admit. He had come to the festival out of boredom, expecting nothing but a few hours of meaningless distraction. Now his curiosity was painfully awake, clawing at him. Later that evening, Charlotte stood behind the cash register of Timeless Pages, the dusty little bookstore where she worked. Her mind replayed the humiliating scene over and over, each iteration worse than the last. She kept seeing his amused grey eyes, his effortless smirk. God, why couldn't she just forget about it? The jingle of the door startled her. She glanced up, and her heart nearly stopped. Ethan stepped inside, looking entirely out of place among the creaky wooden shelves and ancient books. His expensive suit, the way he carried himself, everything screamed different world. He looked right at her, and Charlotte felt her stomach flip violently. "You," she breathed before she could stop herself. Ethan smiled slowly, almost wickedly. "Me?" he confirmed, walking toward the counter with deliberate steps. Charlotte gripped the edge of the desk, her mind scrambling for a way to handle this. "If you're here to press charges for emotional assault, I swear it was accidental," she joked weakly. Ethan laughed, a real deep laugh that surprised her. "I'm not here to press charges," he said. He paused for a second, studying her. "I'm here because I think you owe me a coffee after tackling me in public." Charlotte blinked, stunned into silence. He was serious, or at least he pretended to be. She gaped at him for a second too long, making it awkward before her instincts kicked in. "Fine," she muttered, coming around the counter. "Coffee, but only because I don't want to end up on some viral video titled Psycho Girl Attacks Hot Stranger." Ethan chuckled again, the sound warm, unsettling. He followed her deeper into the bookstore. As she fumbled with the old coffee machine, Charlotte kept sneaking glances at him. Why was he still here? What did he want? The park incident could have ended there. An awkward memory for both to bury. Yet he had tracked her down. It didn't make sense, and Charlotte hated mysteries she couldn't solve. When she finally handed him the mug, their fingers brushed briefly. A jolt of electricity zipped up her arm, sharp and undeniable. Ethan's smile softened into something different, something almost tender. "Thanks, Charlotte," he said, using her name as if they'd known each other forever. She frowned. "I never told you my name." Ethan took a slow sip of the coffee, his grey eyes holding hers over the rim of the mug. "You dropped your name tag when you ran," he said casually. Charlotte swallowed hard. This man wasn't just rich and handsome. He was observant. Too observant. For reasons she couldn't explain, that scared her more than anything else. Charlotte spent the next 2 days convincing herself the encounter was over. Surely Ethan had gotten whatever amusement he wanted from her humiliation and moved on. People like him, sharp suits, confident smirks, didn't linger around dusty bookstores or poor girls who could barely keep the lights on. But deep down, a traitorous part of her wished he hadn't forgotten. It was ridiculous, foolish even, and Charlotte hated herself for it. The bookstore remained quiet that morning, the air filled only with the smell of old paper and brewing coffee. Charlotte reorganized a shelf for the 3rd time, her mind elsewhere. A soft chime from the entrance jolted her back. She turned, expecting another elderly customer browsing for forgotten treasures. Instead, her heart plummeted into her stomach. There he was, Ethan again. He wore jeans and a dark jacket this time, somehow even more dangerously casual than before. Charlotte's throat dried instantly. She considered pretending she didn't recognize him, but Ethan caught her gaze and smiled knowingly. No escape. "Good morning," he said easily, like he dropped by every Tuesday. She forced a polite smile, clenching her hands behind the counter. "What brings you here?" she asked, masking her panic. Ethan leaned on the counter casually, his grey eyes sweeping the cozy space. "I figured you owed me more than just one coffee," he teased lightly. Charlotte scoffed. "I'm not running a tab on accidental hugs," she retorted. His laugh was low and genuine, wrapping around her like a dangerous invitation. He tapped the counter twice with his knuckles. "Besides, I like bookstores," he added, almost as an afterthought. Charlotte arched a skeptical eyebrow. "You? In a place where the Wi-Fi barely works?" Ethan grinned. "Even billionaires need a break. From email sometimes." The word billionaire hit her like a slap, though he said it so nonchalantly it almost sounded fake. Still, the mention of wealth shifted something inside her, a wall slamming down. She forced herself to refocus. "Well, enjoy your break," she said briskly, stepping away to stack some returned books. Ethan didn't follow immediately. Instead, he wandered through the aisles, his fingers trailing over spines, pretending to browse, but Charlotte could feel his gaze pulling toward her like gravity. Minutes stretched painfully long before he spoke again, calling out from a nearby aisle. "What's your favorite book in here?" Charlotte hesitated. She could give a safe answer, some classic everyone pretended to love, or she could tell him the truth. Against her better judgment, she said, "There's a battered copy of The Secret Garden in the children's section. It's mine. Always has. Ibn." Ethan's footsteps grew louder until he appeared at the edge of the shelf. "A story about neglected beauty finding life again," he mused, leaning casually against the wood. Charlotte blinked at him, surprised by the insight. "Not many people see it that way," she murmured. He shrugged one shoulder, a lazy movement that somehow seemed deliberate. "Not many people know how to look." The air between them grew heavier, charged with something she didn't dare name. Charlotte busied herself rearranging a row of fantasy novels to break the moment. Ethan let her. "Tell you what," he said after a beat. "Pick a book for me to read, anything you want." Charlotte frowned, wary. "Why would you want me to do that?" He gave a slow, almost boyish smile that made her heart trip over itself. "Maybe because I'm curious what story you'd want someone like me to hear." Charlotte inhaled sharply. Was this a game to him or something else? She wrestled internally before finally grabbing a worn paperback and handing it over without looking him in the eye. He studied the title, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Courage is found in unexpected places," he read aloud. "Bit on the nose, don't you think?" Charlotte crossed her arms, daring him to mock it. "Maybe that's exactly what you need." Ethan tilted, his head considering her with an unreadable expression. "Maybe it is," he said softly. Before she could respond, her manager, Mr. Aldridge, appeared from the back office, his expression sour. "Charlotte, we're short-staffed today. Can you work a double shift?" She opened her mouth to protest, but the words died when she saw Ethan glance sharply at Aldridge, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. She mumbled a reluctant, "Of course." Ethan lingered a moment longer, then nodded toward the door. "Thanks for the recommendation," he said quietly. "See you around." Charlotte watched him leave, her chest tight with confusing emotions. Relief, disappointment, a dangerous mix of both. The moment the door chimed closed behind him, she released a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She pressed her forehead against the cool surface of the counter, feeling foolish beyond belief. This was not her world. Ethan didn't belong here, among second-hand books, busted cash registers and double shifts. And Charlotte didn't belong in his, no matter how sincere his smile looked or how warm his voice sounded when he said her name. No matter how much a part of her secretly, desperately wished otherwise. The next few days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion. Charlotte worked long shifts at the bookstore, collapsing into bed each night too tired to dream. Yet somewhere, between reshelving books and scrubbing coffee stains, her mind kept drifting back to Ethan, his grey eyes, his knowing smirk, his unexpected insight into her favorite story. She hated how easily he occupied space in her thoughts. Saturday arrived, and with it, the monthly antique market held in the city's old quarter. Charlotte had volunteered to set up a small booth for the bookstore, hoping a few vintage sales could help keep the doors open another month. She arranged the battered first editions and worn hardcovers carefully, breathing in the scent of aged leather and dusty paper. It smelled like survival. The crowd buzzed around her, families strolling with cotton candy, couples hand in hand. Charlotte kept her head down, trying not to feel how lonely she was, selling stories no one wanted anymore, dreaming dreams she couldn't afford. She didn't notice the tall figure approaching until a shadow fell over her booth. She looked up, and there he was, again. Ethan wore a dark sweater and jeans, blending in with the casual weekend crowd. Yet he still managed to look out of place, as if the city bent slightly around him wherever he walked. Charlotte stiffened immediately. "Following me now?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. Ethan chuckled, setting down a coffee cup on her booth like a peace offering. "Coincidence," he said, sipping his own drink. "Besides, you're the one who keeps showing up in places worth visiting." Charlotte rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a tiny, traitorous smile. "Careful," she warned. "Flattery doesn't work on booksellers." Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not flattering the books," he murmured. Charlotte's cheeks flushed and she turned sharply back to her display. "Buy something or keep moving," she muttered. Ethan laughed under his breath, but obeyed, browsing the books with exaggerated seriousness. He picked up a tattered volume, flipping it open. "You know," he said casually, My mother used to collect rare books. Charlotte blinked, surprised. It was the first real personal detail he had ever shared. She glanced at him sideways, cautious. Really? What happened to her collection? Ethan shrugged, his smile fading slightly. Scattered, like most things in life. His voice was so carefully neutral, it raised 1,000 unspoken questions in Charlotte's mind. Before she could press further, a gust of wind knocked over a few books. Both of them scrambled to catch them, hands brushing awkwardly. Charlotte tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, trying to steady herself. Ethan stacked the books neatly, his hands steady, even as his eyes betrayed something fractured, something lonely. As he placed the last book back on the table, Ethan caught sight of an old photograph tucked between two covers. He pulled it out, studying it silently. It was a black-and-white image of the bookstore's original owners, Charlotte's grandparents, standing proudly outside timeless pages decades ago. Ethan's brow furrowed, and he traced the photo's worn edge with his thumb. "This place means something to you," he said finally, more a statement than a question. Charlotte nodded, folding her arms protectively. "It's all I have left of them. Of everything, really." For a moment, the noise of the market seemed to fade, and it was just the two of them, standing among forgotten stories and broken dreams. Ethan slipped the photo gently back between the books. "Memories are fragile," he said quietly, "but the right ones, they're worth fighting for." Charlotte stared at him, unsettled by how easily he seemed to understand things she rarely spoke. Aloud, she cleared her throat, uncomfortable. "You say that like you know." He gave a humorless smile. "Maybe I do." Then, as if realizing he'd said too much, he stepped back. "Anyway," he added lightly, "I'll take this one." He pointed to the battered volume he had picked up earlier. Charlotte rang up the sale, bagging the book carefully. Their fingers brushed again when he took the bag, the touch lingering a second too long. As he walked away, Charlotte found herself wishing he would turn back. That he would say something real, something she could hold on to. But Ethan just raised the bag in a casual farewell and disappeared into the crowd. Charlotte stood there a long time, the echoes of his words swirling around her like smoke. She had told herself to stay guarded, to keep him at a distance. Yet something about Ethan, his smiles hiding sadness, his eyes full of secrets, kept drawing her closer against all logic. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was reckless. But standing there among crumbling paper and fading ink, Charlotte felt the first dangerous tug of hope she hadn't felt in years. The following Monday felt unusually heavy. Rain poured against the bookstore's wide front windows, blurring the street into a watercolor of grey and gold. Charlotte sat behind the counter, chin propped on her hand, staring out into the storm. She hadn't seen Ethan since the market. Part of her was relieved. The other part hated how often she checked the door every time the bell chimed. Business was slow. Only a few soaked customers wandered in, shaking umbrellas and leaving trails of water on the wooden floors. Charlotte busied herself with inventory, pretending not to care. But when the door creaked open around noon and she heard familiar footsteps, her heart stuttered painfully against her ribs. She didn't even have to look to know it was him. Ethan crossed the room like he owned it, his dark jacket dripping, his hair a little messier than usual. He looked real somehow, stripped of the polished armor he usually wore. Charlotte straightened, tucking a loose curl behind her ear. "Forgot your umbrella?" she asked, her voice light, teasing. Ethan gave a lopsided smile. "Maybe I was hoping for an excuse." The tension between them was different today, heavier, more fragile. Ethan set a book down in front of her, the one he had bought at the market. Charlotte frowned, confused. "Returning it already?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I just finished it. Thought maybe you'd want to talk about it." She blinked. People never came back to discuss books. Not anymore. She hesitated, then pulled a chair from behind the counter. Ethan took the unspoken invitation, sitting down across from her. For a moment they just stared at each other, the storm outside filling the silence. Finally Charlotte asked, "What did you think?" Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the table. "It's about second chances," he said simply, "and how we don't always get to choose when they come." Charlotte's throat tightened. She hated how he could so easily peel back her defenses without even trying. She picked at the edge of the counter, needing to ground herself. "Second chances are a luxury," she said after a moment. "Some people don't have time to wait for them." Ethan's eyes darkened slightly. "You're right," he said, softly, "which is why when you find one, you don't waste it." Before Charlotte could respond, the door opened again, and this time a different kind of chill entered the room. Two sharply dressed men, both carrying an air of authority, stepped inside. They exchanged a glance before approaching the counter, ignoring Ethan entirely. Charlotte stood up instinctively, sensing something was wrong. "Miss Holloway?" one of them asked, flipping open a sleek black wallet with an ID badge. "I'm Agent Lawson with the Department of Commerce. We have a few questions regarding the ownership records of this establishment." Charlotte blinked, completely thrown. "Ownership records? What? What are you talking about?" Agent Lawson's expression was cool, unreadable. "It's come to our attention there may be irregularities with the business lease and tax filings. We'd like you to provide documentation immediately." Charlotte's stomach dropped. She barely kept the bookstore afloat month to month. She didn't have the resources for lawyers or audits. Panic clawed at her chest. Ethan rose silently, placing himself slightly between her and the agents. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Charlotte noticed, and her heart twisted strangely. "She's cooperating," Ethan said smoothly, his voice all steel. "Whatever you need, she'll get it." Lawson's eyes flickered toward him, noting the subtle challenge, but said nothing. The agents handed Charlotte a card and left as quickly as they had come, leaving only the heavy stink of fear behind. Charlotte stood frozen, clutching the card with trembling fingers. "This can't be happening," she whispered, more to herself than to Ethan. He stayed silent, letting her process. The rain hammered harder against the windows. Finally, she turned to him, her voice shaking. "Did you know anything about this?" she asked, her fear twisting dangerously into anger. Ethan's jaw tightened. "No," he said firmly, "I swear." But something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like guilt, and Charlotte caught it. Her stomach churned with confusion and suspicion. "You swear," she repeated hollowly. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Charlotte, listen to me. I would never do anything to hurt you. You have to believe that." She stared up at him, struggling to separate truth from lies, instinct from fear. Everything inside her screamed to trust no one, especially not someone who could so easily shatter her. The silence between them stretched thin, brittle as glass. Charlotte tucked the agent's card into her pocket with a shaking hand. "I have to figure this out," she said, stepping back. "Alone." Ethan flinched almost imperceptibly, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face a careful mask. And just like that, the invisible thread connecting them pulled taut and snapped. As Charlotte watched him leave, disappearing into the rain, she felt the first real crack split open inside her chest. She had wanted to believe in second chances, but maybe, just maybe, second chances were only fairy tales after all. The next morning, Charlotte sat at the kitchen table, the agent's business card lying in front of her like a ticking bomb. She hadn't slept a minute, her mind replaying yesterday's events in a brutal loop. Was it a mistake, a misunderstanding, or something worse lurking beneath? She didn't know. And worst of all, she realized she wasn't sure she could trust Ethan anymore. The thought gnawed at her. Oliver, her younger brother, wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. He frowned when he saw the worry etched into her face. "What's wrong, Char?" he asked, pouring cereal with the clumsy urgency of a teenage boy. Charlotte forced a smile that felt all wrong on her face. "Nothing you need to worry about," she lied smoothly. Protecting him was second nature by now, but Oliver wasn't a child anymore. He noticed things. "Does this have anything to do with the guy who keeps showing up at the bookstore?" he pressed, narrowing his eyes. Charlotte stiffened. She hadn't realized Oliver had noticed Ethan too. She shook her head quickly. "No, it's just business stuff, complicated." That much at least was true. After breakfast, Charlotte gathered every document she had about the bookstore, leases, tax records, old receipts, and stuffed them into a battered folder. She would visit the Department of Commerce herself, face this storm head-on. Part of her was tempted to call Ethan, to lean on him, but she crushed the thought. She couldn't afford to need him, not now, not when the ground beneath her felt so unstable. Downtown, the government building loomed like a fortress, all steel and glass and sterile halls. Charlotte clutched her folder tighter as she stepped through the security checkpoint, feeling wildly out of place among the suits and briefcases. An assistant led her into a dim conference room where Agent Lawson was already waiting, a polite smile stretched too tightly across his face. The meeting started with pleasantries and formalities, but quickly turned uncomfortable. Lawson leafed through her papers with a slow, deliberate scrutiny that made Charlotte's palms sweat. "You purchased the lease for Timeless Pages last year," he said, tapping a finger against the documents. "But did you know the original ownership was transferred under questionable circumstances 2 years ago?" Charlotte's mouth went dry. "Questionable how?" she managed. Lawson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "The previous owner defaulted on payments after a corporate acquisition. Some would argue the foreclosure process was accelerated." Charlotte's mind raced. Her grandparents had sold the building years ago, but she had never asked too many questions after taking over the business. "Which corporation?" she asked, though deep down, a cold pit already formed in her gut. Lawson flipped a page and turned it toward her. Printed neatly at the top was the name, Carter Holdings, Inc. Charlotte's hands shook slightly. Carter, as in Ethan Carter, the man she had started to let into her heart, the man whose smile she had started to trust. Lawson continued, unaware of, or perhaps indifferent to, her crumbling composure. "There's no active investigation," he said, "but it's standard to verify compliance when these names resurface." Charlotte barely heard him. The blood roared in her ears. Carter Holdings, Ethan's world, her bookstore's world, intertwined without her even knowing. After the meeting, Charlotte stumbled into the grey afternoon, the rain returning like a cruel joke. She wandered aimlessly through the city streets, folder clutched to her chest. Part of her wanted to believe it was all coincidence, that Ethan hadn't known. But a louder, angrier voice inside whispered, He knew from the beginning. Hours later, Charlotte found herself back at Timeless Pages. She turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards, a comfort she no longer trusted. She placed the folder on the counter and stared at the rows of books, at the world she had fought so hard to keep alive. Was it all just an illusion? Built on lies she never even saw coming. The shop was empty, quiet except for the ticking of the old clock near the entrance. Charlotte paced the aisles restlessly, her mind a cyclone of doubt and fury. She remembered Ethan's small, careful smiles, the way he listened to her ramble about stories and hope and second chances. Had any of it been real? Or was she just another pawn in some game she didn't understand? When the bell over the door jingled, Charlotte spun around, heart Leaping painfully, Ethan stood there, drenched from the rain, his face drawn tight with worry. "I heard you went to the Commerce Office," he said, voice low. Charlotte stared at him, unable to move. He crossed the distance between them slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. "Charlotte," he began. But she held up a hand, stopping him. Cold. "You knew," she said, her voice trembling with fury she could barely contain. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. His silence said more than any words could have. Charlotte laughed bitterly, the sound ugly in the quiet shop. "You knew who I was, what this place meant, and you still—" She broke off, too furious, too betrayed. "I didn't plan it," Ethan said finally, his voice raw. "Meeting you, that wasn't part of anything." Charlotte shook her head, backing away from him like he might hurt her. "But you stayed. You let me trust you. You let me believe you were different." Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him. "I stayed because I wanted to," Ethan said fiercely, "because you made me remember who I was before all this, before the money, before the lies." He took a step closer. Charlotte stepped back. "Don't," she whispered. Ethan's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Please," he said softly, "don't shut me out." But Charlotte was already reaching for the door. As she stepped outside into the storm, the door swinging shut behind her, Charlotte realized the truth she had been trying so hard to avoid. Some betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from the people you almost dared to love. Charlotte didn't remember how she got home. One moment she was stepping out of the bookstore, rain soaking her hair and clothes, and the next she was curled up on her worn couch, knees pulled to her chest. The apartment was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlights leaking through the blinds. She stared blankly at the wall, the events of the day looping in her mind like a cruel movie. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, vibrating insistently against the wood. She didn't need to look to know it was Ethan. He had probably called 6 times already. She ignored it, pressing her forehead against her knees. The betrayal wasn't just about the bookstore. It was about the possibility she had allowed herself to believe, that someone could see her and still stay. Oliver's door creaked open down the hall, and Charlotte stiffened. She didn't want him to see her like this. She wiped at her face, quickly, trying to erase the evidence of her breakdown. "Char?" he called softly. She cleared her throat. "Yeah, Ollie, everything's fine, just tired." Her voice cracked anyway, betraying her. There was a long pause before his door clicked. Shut again. Alone again, Charlotte let herself unravel. She hated how much Ethan's absence hurt. She hated herself more for still wanting him here. Love, she realized bitterly, wasn't just about sweetness and smiles. It was about vulnerability, about handing someone the blade and trusting they wouldn't cut you. And she had been so wrong. Somewhere between the rain and the silence, Charlotte fell into a restless sleep. Her dreams were jagged flashes. Ethan's face in the bookstore, the agents at her door, the bookstore collapsing around her like a house of cards. She woke with a gasp just before dawn, heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. The storm outside had finally broken, but the one inside her still raged. Dragging herself out of bed, Charlotte moved on autopilot. She showered, dressed, made. Coffee she barely tasted. At the bookstore, she opened the doors mechanically, greeting customers with a brittle smile. The place felt hollow, like the soul had been stripped from it. She caught herself glancing at the door every few minutes, hating herself for it. By noon, the exhaustion hit her like a wall. She sank into the old armchair by the children's section, letting her head fall back against the faded fabric. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. When she opened them again, a man was standing over her, not Ethan, an older man in a grey suit with sharp eyes and an impatient frown. "You must be Charlotte Holloway," he said briskly. Charlotte sat up straight, alarm flaring. "Who are you?" she demanded. The man pulled out a business card with a flourish. Jonathan Mercer, Senior Vice President, Carter Holdings. Charlotte's blood turned to ice. "I came to offer a settlement," Mercer continued, oblivious to her mounting panic. He laid a crisp envelope on the table in front of her. "You see, this bookstore is, technically, still tied up in corporate red tape. We could fight it out, or you could accept this offer and walk away. No lawyers, no mess." Charlotte stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. "Why now?" she asked, her voice hollow. Mercer smiled coldly. "Because," he said smoothly, "Mr. Carter's recent personal entanglements have made this a potential liability." Charlotte flinched as if slapped. Personal entanglements, that was what she was to them, a risk, an embarrassment. Mercer straightened his jacket. "I suggest you think it over, but not for too long. Offers like this don't last forever." When he left, Charlotte remained frozen in the chair, the envelope untouched. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Was this Ethan's doing? Was he trying to buy her silence, to erase her the way corporations erased problems they didn't want to deal with? Every part of her screamed against it, against him, against hope. She didn't hear the door open again, didn't realize someone was there until she heard his voice, quiet, rough around the edges. "I didn't know he was coming." Charlotte looked up slowly. Ethan stood there looking more broken than she had ever seen him. No suit, no smirk, just a man stripped bare by regret. "How convenient," she said bitterly, standing. "Another coincidence, Ethan?" He flinched but didn't move. "Charlotte, please, you have to believe me. I never wanted this. I never meant for you to get hurt." His voice cracked on the last word, and it scared her more than any of his lies ever could, because he sounded like he meant it. "You should go," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan took a step forward, desperate. "Don't do this," he said. "Don't let them win." Charlotte shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "You already did." And this time, when she turned away, Ethan didn't follow. He just stood there, drowning in the silence, watching her walk away from him. Ethan stood in the middle of timeless pages long after Charlotte had gone, the old wooden floor creaking under his shoes. The rain had stopped, but the air inside the bookstore felt heavier than ever. He let out a slow, shuddering breath, raking a hand through his hair. Failure tasted bitter on his tongue. He had tried so hard to protect her, and somehow he had only ended up hurting her more. He moved to the counter and picked up the envelope Mercer had left behind. His jaw clenched as he ripped it open, skimming the contents. A generous payout, designed to make Charlotte disappear quietly. Standard practice, ruthless, efficient. It was everything Carter Holdings had become, and everything Ethan despised about the empire built in his family's name. Weeks ago, when he first met Charlotte, by accident, Ethan hadn't known who she was, but the second time, the moment he saw the name Timeless Pages on the faded sign, he had known, and he had made a choice. To get close, to protect from within, without revealing the ugly truths he carried. A coward's choice, a liar's gamble. Now it had cost him everything that mattered. He left the bookstore, rainwater splashing under his feet as he crossed the street to where his car was parked. His driver, an older man named Davis, looked up from his phone, sensing something was wrong. Ethan slid into the back seat without a word. "Where to, sir?" Davis asked cautiously. Ethan stared out the window for a long moment before answering. "Headquarters," he said grimly. "I'm done hiding." The Carter Holdings building loomed against the skyline, its sleek glass facade glittering with false promises. Ethan rode the private elevator to the executive floor, his reflection staring back at him with hard, accusing eyes. He didn't belong here. Not anymore. Maybe he never had. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and he strode down the hall. toward the boardroom. Inside, the vultures were already gathered. Mercer sat at the head of the long table, flanked by other executives, men and women Ethan had known since childhood, all of them carving their slices of the world one soulless acquisition at a time. Conversations hushed as Ethan entered, his presence an unwelcome disruption. Mercer arched an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Mr. Carter," he drawled, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" Ethan threw the settlement papers down onto the polished mahogany table with a loud slap. "You're not buying her out," he said, voice low and lethal. Mercer's smile tightened. "It's not personal, Ethan. It's business. She's a liability." Ethan leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. "She's not a liability. She's the only good thing connected to this company." A murmur rippled around the table, some executives shifting uncomfortably. Mercer's expression hardened. "You're letting personal entanglements cloud your judgment." Ethan barked a humorless laugh. "Judgment? Don't talk to me about judgment when you're the ones gutting communities to fatten your bonuses." His voice rose, shaking with barely restrained fury. "You think because you sit behind contracts and clauses that you're not destroying lives. That bookstore was a family's legacy. It meant something, and you buried it without a second thought." Silence blanketed the room. Mercer stood slowly, smoothing his suit. "If you don't like the way things are run," he said coldly, "perhaps you should reconsider your position here." Ethan met his gaze without blinking. "I already have." The weight of the decision settled over him like a chain breaking. "Effective immediately, I'm stepping down. Sell my shares. Do whatever you want with them. I'm done." A gasp of shock whispered around the table. Mercer's eyes narrowed, calculating. "You're walking away," he said, incredulous. Ethan nodded. "Once. I'm choosing something better." Without another word, he turned and walked out, the soles of his shoes echoing down the long corridor. In the elevator, he finally allowed himself to breathe. It wasn't just a resignation, it was a severing from the life he had been shackled to since birth. And for the first time in years, he felt something dangerously close to freedom. Outside, Davis looked startled when Ethan climbed back into the car alone. "Home, sir?" he asked uncertainly. Ethan shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Take me to Timeless Pages." Davis nodded and pulled into traffic. Ethan leaned back against the seat, exhaustion washing over him. He didn't know if Charlotte would ever forgive him. He didn't know if he deserved forgiveness. But he knew one thing with unshakable certainty. He hadn't fought for the empire his family worshipped. He had fought for her. Charlotte spent the day trying to exist without feeling. She worked through the motions at the bookstore, reshelving, dusting, smiling at customers, but it all felt hollow. Every creak of the door sent her heart leaping before she crushed the hope down again. She told herself she was done waiting for Ethan Carter. She told herself she was better off, but telling herself didn't make it true. That evening, as she was locking up, she found an envelope wedged in the door. Her name scrawled across it in sharp, familiar handwriting. Her heart hammered painfully as she peeled it open, half expecting more corporate threats. But inside was a single sheet of paper. No legal jargon, no demands. Just a handwritten note, messy and raw. "I resigned. Meet me at the place where everything started. Please." Her fingers trembled. Resigned. Doubt gnawed at her, battling against the stubborn ache in her chest. It could be a trick. Another lie wrapped in pretty words. She crumpled the note in her fist, turning off the lights and stepping out into the cool night air. The city buzzed faintly around her, but Charlotte barely heard it over the roaring in her ears. She didn't owe him anything. She should stay, away, but her feet betrayed her, carrying her through the streets without conscious thought, past glowing shop windows, empty benches, and flickering street lamps, toward the park, toward the fountain where it had all begun, where she had thrown herself into a stranger's arms and started a story she never asked for. The park was almost empty now, the festival lights gone, the night settling heavy and still. She spotted him instantly, Ethan, sitting on the low stone wall near the fountain, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of all the polish and bravado she had once associated with him. Just a man, alone, waiting. Charlotte kept her distance, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "I got your note," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Ethan stood slowly, hands at his sides. No suit tonight, just jeans and a worn jacket. He looked at her like she was the only thing holding him together. "Thank you for coming," he said hoarsely. She said nothing, letting the silence stretch and sting between them. Finally he spoke again, each word carefully measured. "I walked away," he said, "from all of it. The board, the company, my shares, everything." Charlotte flinched, part of her wanting to believe, part of her terrified to. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you were right," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "About everything. About what the company had become, about who I had let myself become." He took a slow step toward her, not closing the distance completely. "I didn't want to be part of something that destroys good things, especially not the best thing I've ever found." Charlotte shook her head, her throat tight. "You still lied to me," she said. "You still let me believe you were someone you weren't." Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. "I know," he said, "and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But meeting you wasn't a lie. Caring about you wasn't a lie." The ache inside her threatened to split her open. She wanted so badly to believe him, to run into his arms and pretend none of it had happened. But she couldn't forget the betrayal, the way her trust had been shattered like fragile glass. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Ethan said quietly. "Not yet, maybe not ever. I'm just asking for a chance to prove I'm not the man you think I am." His honesty floored her, more powerful than any grand apology. "Could have been." Charlotte wrapped her arms tighter around herself, staring down at her shoes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The night stretched between them, filled with all the things they couldn't say. Finally, Charlotte looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no anger in them, no arrogance, just hope, and a grief so raw it cracked something open inside her. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool air. "I need time," she said finally. Ethan nodded immediately, as if he had expected nothing less. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll wait, however long it takes." Charlotte's throat tightened painfully. She turned and walked away without another word, her heart breaking all over again, not from betrayal this time, but from the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, some broken things could still be mended. And behind her, Ethan remained by the fountain, a silent sentinel waiting in the dark. Days stretched into weeks, and life at Timeless Pages slowly resumed its rhythm. Charlotte buried herself in work, finding comfort in the familiar tasks of shelving books, brewing coffee, and wiping down dusty counters. But underneath her steady hands and polite smiles, a storm still raged quietly. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired, especially when her heart still ached for the man who had broken it. Ethan didn't force his way back into her life. He didn't call, he didn't send flowers or grand apologies. Instead, he showed up in small ways, ways that almost made her heart hurt more. Sometimes he left rare book donations at the store without leaving his name. Sometimes he simply sat across the street on a bench reading a book, never approaching unless she looked at him first. At first, Charlotte ignored him, pretended he wasn't there, pretended the weight of his gaze didn't feel like a thread pulling her apart. But over time, the anger inside her dulled into something quieter, something more dangerous. She started noticing the way Ethan waited even on rainy days, coat soaked, a paperback open in his hands, how he never crossed the invisible line she had drawn. One evening, after closing up, she found a small box left by the door. Inside was a battered first edition of The Secret Garden, her favorite story. No note, no signature, just the gift, speaking volumes Ethan was too cautious to voice aloud. Charlotte pressed the book to her chest, tears burning behind her eyes. She hated how much it moved her, hated how much she still cared. Oliver noticed the change too. He cornered her in the kitchen one night, arms folded, a knowing look on his face. "You still love him," he said simply. Charlotte froze, staring at the sink full of dishes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she muttered, but the words rang hollow even to her own ears. Oliver just shook his head, smiling sadly. "He screwed up," Oliver said. "But he's fighting for you, Char. How many people ever really do that?" She wanted to argue, wanted to cling to her anger because it was safer than hope. But her brother's words echoed in her chest long after he left the room, haunting her dreams and waking hours alike. One grey Saturday morning, Charlotte found herself crossing the street without thinking. Ethan was there as always, sitting quietly with a book. He looked up when he saw her approaching, surprise flashing across his face. He closed the book carefully, as if preparing for a blow he wasn't sure he could survive. Charlotte stopped a few feet away, arms folded tightly. "I never said thank you," she said, her voice stiff. Ethan stood slowly, keeping his hands at his sides. "You don't have to." She shook her head. "I do." The silence stretched between them again, not as sharp this time, softer, sadder. "You gave up everything," she said quietly. "For me." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "I didn't do it for gratitude," he said. "I did it because it was right, and because you're—" He trailed off, searching for words heavy enough to carry the truth. "Because you're worth it," he finished simply. Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind whip her hair around her face. She was so tired of fighting everything she felt. She opened her eyes and met his gaze, steady and raw. "I'm not ready," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared." Ethan stepped closer, slowly, carefully. "Then let's be scared. Together," he said. Charlotte laughed, a broken, breathless sound that startled both of them. For the first time in weeks, the weight in her chest lifted slightly. She didn't move when he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. Didn't flinch when he took her hand gently in his. They stood there like that, two broken people trying to find the courage to hope again. Charlotte squeezed his hand back, just a little, and Ethan's entire face changed, lighting up with a relief so profound it made her heart ache. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but maybe, just maybe, it was the first step toward something real. Toward learning how to breathe again. The days that followed were like learning to walk on ice, each step careful, tentative, uncertain. Charlotte and Ethan didn't rush back into what they had before. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures, just small moments that stitched themselves slowly into something tentative and real. A shared coffee on a bench, quiet conversations about books, smiles that lingered longer than they should have. One rainy afternoon, Charlotte found herself standing at the bookstore's front window, watching Ethan struggle to set up a makeshift umbrella stand he had insisted on buying for her. The thing collapsed twice before he figured it out, and she couldn't stop the laugh that bubbled out. It felt strange, foreign, to laugh like that again, but it also felt good, like exhaling after holding her breath for too long. Later, as she restocked the children's section, Ethan wandered over, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "You always hide back here when you're nervous," he observed with a small smile. Charlotte shot him a wary look. "Maybe I just like the company of books more than people." Ethan shrugged easily. "Good thing I'm halfway decent at pretending to be a book then." Charlotte snorted despite herself, rolling her eyes. But inside, something warmed. This was the Ethan she had glimpsed before, the one who wasn't all suits and secrets, the one who laughed too easily and looked at her like she was made of something rare and precious. She didn't trust it fully yet, but she wanted to, and maybe wanting was the first step. Ethan never pushed, never asked for more than she was willing to give. Some days they barely spoke at all, sharing space without pressure. Other days, they found themselves lost in conversations that stretched for hours, about dreams, regrets, the books they loved, the places they still wanted to see. Charlotte learned that Ethan had once wanted to be a writer, before his family's expectations crushed that dream. "You would have been a good one," she said one evening as they sat on the bookstore floor, sorting through old poetry anthologies. Ethan looked at her, something soft and aching in his eyes. "I think I forgot how to dream," he admitted. Charlotte closed a book gently, setting it aside. "Then maybe it's time to remember." It was the bravest thing she had said in weeks. Not everything was easy. There were still moments when Charlotte recoiled without meaning to, flinching at unexpected touches or harsh words overheard from strangers. Moments when the old hurt rose up like a wave, threatening to drown her. But Ethan never got angry, never withdrew. He simply stayed, patient, steady, a lighthouse against the storm. One night, as she closed the shop, she found Ethan standing outside with 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate. No words, just an offering. She took one with a small nod, their fingers brushing. They stood in silence, sipping slowly as the city buzzed quietly around them. For once, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was peaceful, almost sacred. Charlotte stared at the stars peeking through the clouds, feeling something stir deep inside her. Hope, maybe, or the fragile beginnings of it. "Why are you still?" "Here," she asked suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Because some things," he said simply, "are worth the wait." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She wasn't ready yet, but she was closer than she had been. She offered him a small, shaky smile, and Ethan smiled back like it was the greatest gift he had ever received. Maybe it was. Maybe trust wasn't about grand gestures after all. Maybe it was built in moments exactly like this. The weeks rolled into months, and slowly, Charlotte let herself lean a little more into Ethan's presence. They weren't lovers. Not yet. They weren't even officially together. But there was something stronger binding them now, a choice, renewed every day, a quiet promise that no matter how slow the healing, they would face it together. Ethan never complained, never demanded more. And in his quiet patience, Charlotte found the space to remember who she was without fear. She remembered how to laugh without guilt, how to hope without trembling, how to dream without flinching from the possibility of pain. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real, she realized, was infinitely better than perfect. The bookstore began to thrive too, almost as if reflecting the changes inside her. New customers wandered in, drawn by some invisible current of warmth and renewal. Charlotte found herself hosting small events, poetry readings, book club meetings, and each night she locked the doors with a heart just a little fuller than the day before. And Ethan was always there, in the background, never pushing, always believing, watching her rebuild her world piece by piece, not for him, but for herself, and maybe, just maybe, for the life they hadn't yet dared to imagine together. It was a Thursday afternoon when the first tremor shook the fragile ground Charlotte and Ethan had built. The bookstore buzzed with soft conversation and the scent of fresh coffee. Charlotte was restocking a display when she noticed Ethan stiffen by the front counter, his whole body tensing like a wire pulled taut. She followed his gaze and saw a woman walk in, tall, poised and painfully familiar. Isabella Reed, Ethan's ex-fiancée. the woman who had once been a permanent fixture in the headlines next to his name. She was even more stunning in person, sharp, cheekbones, designer clothes, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Charlotte felt her stomach knot instantly. She forced herself to keep moving, pretending not to notice, but every nerve in her body was screaming. Isabella's heels clicked against the old floorboards as she made a beeline for Ethan. He straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "Isabella," he said, his voice low and tight. She smiled sweetly, glancing briefly at Charlotte before focusing on him. "Ethan, so this is where you've been hiding." Her tone dripped with condescension, polished and sharp. Charlotte busied herself behind the counter, stacking receipts that didn't need stacking. She didn't want to listen, but the conversation floated to her anyway. "I heard about your generous departure from Carter Holdings," Isabella said, smoothly. "Very noble, very foolish." Ethan didn't flinch. "What do you want?" he asked, voice flat. Isabella's smile widened. "Just checking in on an old friend," she said innocently, "and maybe offering a piece of advice. You can walk away from power, Ethan, but it doesn't walk away from you." Charlotte risked a glance up and caught the brief flicker of unease in Ethan's eyes before he masked it. Something cold and heavy settled in her chest. Isabella didn't linger. She dropped a sleek business card onto the counter and turned, her perfume lingering long after she was gone. Ethan stared after her for a long moment, his hands clenched at his sides. Charlotte swallowed hard, then said quietly, "Want to tell me what that was about?" Ethan didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "She's not just an ex," he said. "She's a warning." Charlotte frowned. "A warning for what?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized now as pure frustration. "When I left Carter Holdings, I didn't just walk away from a paycheck. I walked away from people who aren't used to losing, people who see loyalty as weakness, and now they're coming for me." Charlotte leaned against the counter, trying to process it all. "Coming for you how?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Financial pressure, legal threats, smear campaigns if necessary." He met her gaze, and she saw the real fear there. The fear not for himself, but for the small, fragile life they had begun to build. For her. For a long moment, Charlotte said nothing. She let the silence stretch between them, full of things, too heavy to name. Then softly she asked, "And what happens to us if they succeed?" Ethan's face twisted with pain. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I won't let them touch you. I swear it." His voice shook with the force of the promise. Charlotte pressed her fingers against the counter, grounding herself. She thought about all the walls she had rebuilt, the trust she had dared to extend piece by piece. Was she strong enough to hold it now, when the storm finally came? Was she strong enough to hold him? She wasn't sure, and that terrified her more than anything. That night, after they closed the bookstore, Charlotte sat on the old armchair by the window, staring out at the city lights. Ethan sat across from her, silent, waiting. Finally she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm scared, Ethan." His eyes softened, and he crossed the room slowly, sinking to his knees in front of her. "I am too," he said, his voice breaking. He took her hands gently in his. "But if we let fear decide for us, they win. We lose everything we're fighting for." Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the sting of unshed tears. She knew he was right, but knowing didn't make it easier. Trust didn't erase fear. Love didn't erase danger. She opened her eyes and met his gaze, raw and vulnerable. "We have to be smart," she said. "We have to be ready." Ethan nodded, pressing her knuckles to his lips. "Whatever it takes," he whispered. And in that fragile, terrifying moment, Charlotte realized something that made her chest ache with its beauty. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for each other. It happened on a Wednesday, just as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, leaving the streets bathed in eerie blue twilight. Charlotte was alone at the bookstore, wiping down the counter, when the knock came. Sharp, deliberate, too forceful to be casual. She froze, every instinct screaming. No customer knocked like that. Heart pounding, she edged toward the door, peeking out. A man stood there wearing a dark suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He tapped again, slower this time. "Miss Holloway," he called, voice muffled through the glass, "I have a message for you." Charlotte's pulse roared in her ears. Every instinct told her to lock the door and walk away. But something colder, heavier, rooted her to the spot. She cracked the door open just a sliver. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. The man smiled wider. "Just someone delivering a friendly reminder." He pulled a crisp envelope from his jacket and slid it through the gap. "Think carefully about who you trust," he said softly. "And remember, not everyone survives crossing powerful people." Before Charlotte could react, he turned and disappeared into the dusk, swallowed by the crowded street. She stared at the envelope for a long moment before picking it up with trembling fingers. It was heavier than it should have been, weighted with invisible threats. She shut the door quickly, locking it and pulling the shades down before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no signature, just a sentence printed neatly in black ink. "If you don't walk away, you'll lose more than a bookstore." Charlotte dropped the paper as if it burned her. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the floor behind the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't fall apart. Not now. Not when it mattered most. She grabbed her phone and dialed Ethan's number with shaking hands. He answered on the first ring. "Charlotte?" His voice was full of immediate concern. She opened her mouth to speak, but all that came out was a choked, I need you," she managed. "Now." There was a scuffle of movement on the other end, keys jangling, an engine roaring to life. "I'm coming," Ethan said, fierce and sure. "Stay inside, lock the door, don't open it for anyone." Charlotte slid down further against the counter, clutching the phone like a lifeline. She listened to the sound of Ethan breathing, steady and grounding. Minutes later, headlights flooded the front windows, and Charlotte saw Ethan sprinting up the steps 2 at a time. She unlocked the door, just long enough to let him in before bolting it again. He gathered her into his arms without a word, holding her so tightly it hurt. She buried her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of him. When she finally pulled back, Ethan cupped her face, searching her eyes. "What happened?" She handed him the envelope wordlessly. His face darkened as he read it, his jaw clenching so tightly she thought it might break. "They're escalating," he muttered. "I should have seen this coming. I should have—" He broke off, furious with himself. "It's not your fault," Charlotte said, surprising both of them. Her voice was small, but certain. "They're trying to scare me, to scare us." Ethan's eyes blazed with something wild and protective. "I'm not letting them touch you," he said fiercely. "I'll burn everything down before I let them." The rawness in his voice scared her and thrilled her all at once. They spent the night barricaded inside the bookstore, too afraid to leave, too stubborn to surrender. Charlotte curled up on the old couch with a blanket, while Ethan kept watch near the door, tense and silent. She watched him through half-closed eyes, the way his body never fully relaxed, the way his fists curled at every sound from outside. At some point, exhaustion won. Charlotte drifted off into a restless sleep filled with broken dreams. Of falling, buildings, of unseen enemies lurking in the dark. When she woke, the first thing she saw was Ethan, still awake, still watching over her like a sentry. Her heart twisted painfully. He was fighting battles she could barely see. Battles he never asked her to fight with him. In the quiet grey light of dawn, Charlotte sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Ethan turned toward her, his face haggard with worry and lack of sleep. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Charlotte shook her head. "Don't apologize," she said. "You warned me this would happen." She paused, then added more softly, "And I stayed anyway." Their eyes locked across the dim room, full of 1,000 things neither dared to say aloud. Fear, hope, love. They had no idea what was coming next, only that they would have to face it together, or not at all. The morning after the threat felt different, heavier. Charlotte brewed coffee with trembling hands, the familiar smell grounding her even as her mind raced. Ethan sat at the counter, staring at the message again, his face carved from stone. They had avoided talking about it for hours, as if silence could somehow protect them. But now, the time for denial had passed. "We can't stay like this," Charlotte said finally, setting a cup in front of him. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Ethan didn't move at first, just stared into the swirling black coffee. "I know," he said eventually. "They're trying to scare us into silence, into running." Charlotte leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "It's almost working," she admitted, her voice small. Ethan looked up sharply, guilt flashing in his eyes. "I never wanted to drag you into this," he said. "If you want to walk away—" Charlotte cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." Her chest tightened, fierce and aching. "I chose this, Ethan. I chose you. I'm scared, but I'm not a coward." The intensity of her words seemed to stun him. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of everything they hadn't said pressing down between them. Finally, Ethan stood, pulling a crumpled folder from his jacket. "Then we fight," he said, his voice rough. "But we do it smart. We hit them where it hurts, publicly." He laid out the plan carefully, exposing Carter Holdings' corruption, leaking documents he had gathered before resigning, rallying public support for small businesses like Timeless Pages. Charlotte listened, her heart pounding harder with every word. It was dangerous, reckless, but for the first time in weeks it felt like they had a sliver of power in their hands. "We can't do it alone," Charlotte said slowly, flipping through the evidence. "We'll need allies, journalists, lawyers, people who can't be bought." Ethan nodded grimly. "I've already reached out to a few." His eyes met hers across the table, burning with determination. "But it only works if we stand together, if you still want to." Charlotte closed the folder, pressing her palm flat against it. She thought about everything they had survived, every betrayal, every scar. Fear still gnawed at the edges of her mind, but underneath it, something stronger was rising, a fierce, stubborn hope. She lifted her chin. "We stand," she said, "together." Ethan's smile was small and shattered and beautiful. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her like he never wanted to let go. She buried her face in his chest, breathing him in, memorizing the steady beat of his heart. For a moment they just stood there, 2 broken souls daring to believe they could still win. The next days were a whirlwind. Meetings with lawyers, interviews with journalists brave enough to take the risk. Late nights spent scanning documents, highlighting every buried scandal, every dirty deal Carter Holdings had ever tried to hide. The city buzzed with rumors, and the air around the bookstore grew electric with tension and possibility. Charlotte found strength she didn't know she had. She spoke at rallies, shared her story on the news, became the face of a small rebellion against giants. Ethan stayed close by, never pushing, always supporting. Watching her rediscover her fire made him fall in love with her all over again, deeper, fiercer, without reservation. But the threats didn't stop. Vandalism at the bookstore, harassing phone calls, dark cars parked outside her apartment for hours. Fear clung to her like a second skin, but Charlotte refused to back down. Every attack only steeled her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every small dream they had tried to crush. One night, after another long day of battle, Charlotte stood in front of the bookstore, staring up at the old sign illuminated under the streetlights. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him, closing her eyes. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" she whispered. "Every damn day," Ethan said. He kissed the side of her head, his lips warm and steady. "And every day, I decide yes." Charlotte smiled through the lump in her throat. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other, and the certainty that whatever happened next, they would face it together. No more lies, no more running. As the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and hope through the city, Charlotte realized something profound. They were no longer standing at the edge of everything. They were ready to leap and build something stronger on the way down. The city buzzed with rumors the morning the story broke. Every newsstand, every radio station, every screen pulsed with one name: Carter Holdings. The expose hit harder than anyone predicted. Corruption, exploitation, threats against small businesses like timeless pages. Ethan and Charlotte sat side by side at the bookstore's back table, watching it unfold with bated breath. The walls felt too small to hold the gravity of what they had started. Reporters gathered outside the bookstore, their cameras flashing against the windows. Supporters too, ordinary people carrying signs that read, "Save our stories," and "People before profit." Charlotte watched, stunned, as the crowd grew thicker by the hour. She clutched Ethan's hand under the table, squeezing tightly. "It's happening," she whispered. Ethan smiled, weary but proud. "We're not invisible anymore." But with the light came shadows. Isabella Reed returned, flanked by corporate lawyers, issuing statements filled with polished lies. The board of Carter Holdings fought back viciously, spinning narratives, filing lawsuits, trying to drown the truth in paperwork and noise. Charlotte received anonymous threats again, harsher this time, colder. The message was clear: stop or pay the price. The bookstore became a fortress. Volunteers helped reinforce doors, neighbors brought food and supplies. It wasn't just a fight for Charlotte anymore. It was a fight for all of them, for every forgotten dream, every small voice trampled by power. And somehow, amidst the fear and exhaustion, Charlotte found a strength she didn't know she had. Ethan was a rock at her side, tireless, unflinching. When doubts crept in, he reminded her why they had started. When the fear clawed at her throat, he wrapped her in his arms and whispered, "We're too close to give up now." She believed him because she wanted to, because the alternative, losing everything again, was unbearable. On the third day, a formal injunction arrived. Carter Holdings was suing Charlotte for defamation. It was a calculated move, designed to break her spirit. Ethan read the paperwork silently, then tore it in half with steady hands. "Let them come," he said. "We're ready." But Charlotte saw the tightness around his eyes, the exhaustion in his bones. This war was costing him too. That night, as the city slept restlessly, they met their allies in an abandoned loft downtown. Journalists, lawyers, activists, all gathered around flickering laptops and coffee-stained tables. Plans were made, evidence compiled, witnesses prepared to testify. It wasn't just about timeless pages anymore. It was about a system built to crush the people who dared to dream. Charlotte stood up and addressed the room, her voice trembling but clear. "They think if they scare us enough, we'll disappear, that we'll forget why we're fighting." She looked around, locking eyes with every tired, determined face. "But we're not going anywhere. They can take everything, our money, our comfort, our security, but they can't take our voice." Applause erupted, ragged but real. Ethan watched her from across the room, pride and love shining through the fatigue. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was leading, and somehow, through all the darkness, she still carried light inside her. Light that made him believe, against all odds, that they could still win. The final showdown came the next morning, courtrooms packed, cameras rolling. Carter Holdings lawyers sneered from across polished tables, drowning in paper and procedure. But Charlotte stood her ground, telling the story not just of a stolen bookstore, but of stolen lives and stolen dreams. Her words rang out like thunder, shaking walls built to silence her. Ethan testified too, exposing secrets he had once been complicit in hiding. He spoke without shame, without flinching. He named names, shared documents, burned every bridge he had once been forced to walk. By the end of it, the courtroom buzzed with something electric, something dangerous to those who thought themselves untouchable. Verdicts would take time, appeals would drag on, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The truth was out. Charlotte and Ethan walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, blinking against the harsh sunlight. Reporters shouted their names, cameras clicked, but for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. "We did it," Charlotte whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Ethan brushed them away with shaking fingers, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "No," he said softly, "you did it." She laughed, broken and beautiful, pulling him into a fierce, desperate hug. Around them the city roared and raged. But in each other's arms they found shelter. The storm had broken, and somehow, impossibly, they were still standing. Weeks. Later the city moved on, as cities always do. New scandals replaced old ones. New battles demanded fresh headlines. But for Charlotte and Ethan, life had finally slowed into something quieter, something sweeter. The bookstore reopened fully after the repairs, brighter than ever, fairy lights strung across the windows, laughter echoing through the aisles. It felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. Charlotte stood behind the counter one Saturday morning, watching families browse the shelves, children tugging at their parents' hands, students debating over novels. She pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed by gratitude. Somehow, against all odds, this place, this dream, had survived. She had survived, and she wasn't alone anymore. She glanced toward the window where Ethan was fixing the crooked sign again. He caught her watching and flashed a boyish smile that still made her heart trip over itself. She rolled her eyes fondly, pretending to be exasperated. Ethan mouthed dramatically, "I got this," before nearly toppling the ladder. Charlotte laughed out loud, drawing a few amused looks from customers. Happiness wasn't grand declarations or perfect moments. It was this, messy, real, the quiet miracle of ordinary days. Later they sat on the front steps as the sun set behind, the skyline bathing the street in molten gold. Ethan handed her a coffee, extra sugar just the way she liked it. They sipped in companionable silence, watching the city hum around them. No more secret enemies, no more waiting for the next blow, just the peace of two people finally learning how to simply be. "You ever think about what's next?" Charlotte asked, her voice soft. Ethan tilted his head back, considering the question. "Seriously, I think about 100 futures," he said. "All of them have you in them." Charlotte smiled, warmth blooming through her chest. She set her coffee down carefully and reached for his hand, weaving their fingers together. Ethan squeezed her hand gently, like he was still afraid she might disappear. "I don't need a mansion," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder, "or some perfect life. I just need this, us, as we are." Ethan kissed the top of her head, lingering there. "You're my home now," he whispered. The words sank deep into her bones, settling where fear used to live. They didn't need more promises. They didn't need grand speeches. They had fought, bled, cried, and still chosen each other. Every day they woke up and chose again, and that, more than any vow, was enough. A few months later, Charlotte found herself standing in front of a small crowd inside the bookstore. It was the first anniversary of Timeless Page's rebirth. She looked out at the faces, friends, neighbors, even strangers who had believed in her, and cleared her throat. "This place isn't just about books," she said, voice trembling. "It's about stories, about second chances, about the people who refuse to be forgotten." Applause filled the room, echoing against the old walls. Ethan stood at the back, arms crossed, pride etched across his face. Their eyes met across the crowd, and for a moment everything else fell away. Charlotte smiled through the tears, threatening to spill over, feeling her heart swell to the point of bursting. After the event, Ethan pulled her aside behind one of the shelves. He took her hands in his, nervous for the first time in forever. "I have something for you," he said. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, curious. He pulled out a small box and opened it to reveal a simple silver ring, not flashy, not perfect, just honest, like them. "It's not about possession," Ethan said quickly, "or fixing something broken. It's about building something new, together." Charlotte stared at him, her vision blurring with tears. She didn't need to think, didn't need speeches. She just threw her arms around him, burying her face in his neck. "Yes," she whispered fiercely. "Yes, yes, yes." They laughed against each other, the sound full of something raw and limitless. Around them, the bookstore bustled, with life, strangers becoming friends, stories weaving themselves into the walls. Outside, the city kept rushing forward, but inside, timeless pages, time stood still, cradling their little world carefully in its hands. Years later, when people asked how it all started, Charlotte would smile and say, "With a wrong hug, a mistake that turned into a miracle, a collision that became a home, and through every storm and shadow, they had chosen love, and it had chosen them right back." If you've made it this far, let us know what you thought about the story. Rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to subscribe to catch all our upcoming stories.